Okay, we are ready to go. So, thank you very much, and a big welcome for this first event organized by the Enterprise for Society Center. The Enterprise for Society Center is a three-institution new initiative, and indeed we are going to be playing with the number 3 today, and we are going to have a short introduction, but by 3 of us. This is a trinity, and I'm not going to tell you who is whom. Yes, still I will. I am Jean-Pierre Dantine. I am representing EPFL here, and I am the managing director of this new center, Enterprise for Society. Anand Narasimhan is going to follow. He is representing IMD. And Raphaël Lalive, professor at HEC Lausanne, representing the university. A few words about our center, given that we are into the very, very first event. As I said, Trinity because of 3 institutions, Trinity because there are 3 main ideas, if you want. It's a center that relies on technology. It's a center that is centered on management. We are talking about the economy, the firms, the enterprises, the entrepreneurs, and we are talking about sustainability. And this justifies the fact that we are 3 institutions, EPFL, a big technology school, IMD, top of the management in the management league, HEC Lausanne, HEC University, thinking about taking care of the society at large and the economics behind all what we will want to do. So we are joining forces to address the current societal and industrial challenges and preparing what we call the great transition towards the economy of the future, which we'll have to spell out, but probably partly in a different event. Enterprise for Society Center, responsible management, sustainable technology, and the number 3 comes up again. At the moment we have 3 pillars: train, inspire, activate, change. And in particular, we will do that with an innovating spirit. We want to be the innovation lab of our 3 institutions, where we will explore new ways of fulfilling our missions. Train, that is more classical in a sense, because yes, we are working on a new master's program, which will be a master in sustainable management and technology. We want to train the leaders, the future leaders of the economy, the future entrepreneurs, those who are going to be motivating changes and implementing changes. They should be motivated and equipped to make their organization the creator of private and social value. And they share with us the conviction that it is the integration of better economic governance with thoughtful and innovative technology that is going to represent the solution of the world's main challenges. Of course, a new master's program is not something that we can create in the quick of a hand. It takes a little bit of time, approval, etc. So we will officially launch it this fall for first student class coming in in September 2021. Second pillar that I moved on second, it's activate change, and that's the idea that we are convinced that the complementarity between our institutions represent a tremendous opportunities to strengthen the local startup innovation system. You know, it's already very strong, it's already very vibrant, but we have identified a number of things that, again, we can do because we are so complementary, and this will be the second stream of action. The third one is inspire, that is, it's at the level of ideas. We will be producing research, but we will be also collecting and disseminating research. We want to build on these competencies that we have on our 3 campuses, and we already have 7 projects that are being launched with 70 researchers involved across the 3 campuses. Transdisciplinary, because we believe that's part of where the solution resides, and because by definition we have different perspectives at EPFL, at the university, and at IMD. More will come on e4society.org, But I will now give the floor to Anand, who will tell you a little bit about these 7 research platforms.
Right. Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Thank you very much. So welcome from my side. I'm Anand Narasimhan, Dean of Research and Faculty at IMD. So I'm very proud to stand with our partners here to introduce E4S, specifically talking a little bit about the research program that we have put together. So what is different about this is that it's drawing, the first set of research platforms are drawing together the 3 institutions, and they are leveraging the strengths of the 3 institutions, not just to advance scientific knowledge, but also to have an impact on policy and change society. So I'm a professor of leadership, so if I pick one of these, it's automatic detection of leadership from voice and body. So you see that just as a bullet point. But what it means to me is that we combine some of the deep expertise that's there at EPFL in terms of recognition of facial features, body movements through machine-enabled technology. And then we combine that with the deep research expertise that's there at UNIL on studies of charisma, studies of body language that's being done by Professor John Antonakis, Professor Marianne Schmidt-Mast. And then we put together the faculty at IMD who essentially work to bring this to a managerial audience, learn from that, and then refine the research questions. So what this does is complements the strengths that each institution has into a research program that's really cutting edge. So we have identified 7 such initiatives which we believe will move the needle. So let me take this opportunity to hand over to my colleague Raphael to talk in depth about one of them, which is shaping the future of work. So welcome, Raphael.
Thank you, Anand. All right, so I'd like to just give you a brief glimpse into one of the research initiatives shaping the future of work. We are a network, and it's Bettina Büchel from IMD, David Atienza from EPFL, and Benjamin Müller from UNIL that are coordinating this together with me. Now, there are 2 major forces that are acting upon jobs today. One force is technology is getting better and better and better. And that just displaces many of the things we did. Computers can look at pictures and they know what they see. They don't actually see, but they can classify pictures, right? And that has, so the force that goes from that is automation. But there's another force. The fact that we invent technology, that's for a reason. It's to make us better. The smartphone, for instance, helps me coordinate things more than I can actually handle, my brain can handle. So what do we do with this? We're taking these 2 forces that are acting upon jobs today very seriously. And we're thinking about, so what kind of future for the jobs market? So what can we do? With automation, we cannot just sit still. We can identify people who are facing risks of automation and try to suggest new skills that would help them, be resilient against them. And at the same time, with augmentation, there are forms of augmentation that we like and some that are going to be hazardous for us. Artificial general intelligence, for instance. There was a big talk yesterday. That's very dangerous. So we're looking at skills, the job market, and most importantly also on society. So what are the rules that we need that just lead us to the future that we want? We are working on these topics basically in 2 ways. We collaborate. That's exactly how Anand discussed it. So we collaborate also with you, people from the business world, academics and business. That's a winning team because we often know how to look at questions, but we don't have the right ones or the interesting ones, because those are usually the ones that are inspired by practice. We also communicate, and not only to a research community, but to you, the business leaders of this region. We want to talk with you and exchange, but also to society at large. Okay, that's E4S. Let me now give you a few words for the main speaker tonight. It's David Autor. David is very modest. He asked me not to develop a lengthy introduction. So here's 5 things I can say about him. He's the Ford Professor of Economics at MIT. Ford Automation, it's a very telling title. The second one, he's co-directing the MIT initiative on the future of work. So there was some selfish reason we invited you, David, because we want to see what you guys are doing and learn about the future of work. Then David, he started working very early on about computers. So his very first paper was entitled, "Have Computers Changed the Labor Market?" It's a question. And ever since, David has developed the most profound insights into how technology drives inequality, polarization, also everything about the globalization and how it affects the labor markets today and how people feel and how they eventually vote if they're asked on policy. So that's very interesting and very profound insights. Last but not least, David received numerous prizes, and just one of them that I can mention here, he's a recipient of the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, which is given to only a very few select scholars in the US. So I'd like you to welcome David with a big round of applause here on stage.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here at the launch of this institution. And I hope to set the stage for the conversation. I'm going to speak for 40 minutes or so, and then I have abundant time for questions. So please type your questions into Slido, and I'll do my best to respond to them. So let me start off. If you think about it, many of the great inventions of the last 200 years were designed specifically to replace labor. So the tractor was built to replace animal and human muscle power with internal combustion power. The assembly line was designed to replace slow artisanal labor with machine precision. The digital computer was built to eliminate cumbersome, error-prone human calculation and replace it with digital perfection. And these technologies have worked. We no longer dig ditches by hand. We don't pound tools out of wrought iron. We don't do bookkeeping with books. So we have displaced an enormous amount of human labor and human expertise through our innovation, through our creation of new technologies that were specifically designed and have succeeded in substituting for humans in many work tasks. And yet, as that process has unfolded, in general, in most advanced countries, I'll be putting up data primarily from the US, the share of the adult population engaged in the paid labor force has risen in almost every decade of the last century. Now you might say, how is that even possible? How could it be going higher? Well, of course, an important part of that is the entry of women into the labor force. Our rising wealth and our greater productivity has, to some important extent, freed women from unpaid, in many cases monotonous and very much constrictive work, and allowed them, or made it feasible for both women and men to engage in more creative and a greater variety and many more choices in the form of work. So as we have automated, we've also raised employment. So I want to now sort of put that in perspective and try to focus on that paradox and talk about what it means for the interpretation of the past and what that might tell us about the future as well. So I'm going to talk about 4 points. One, why are there still so many jobs? Why haven't we actually eliminated all this work? Why aren't we doing less given how much we've automated? 2, I want to talk specifically about new work. And I think it's impossible to talk about the topic of the machine substitution of work without thinking about what new work looks like and where it comes from. Third, I want to talk about the question of what we should worry about. And I think there are things to worry about, although what I'm worried about may not be the same thing you're worried about. So hopefully by the end, you'll also be worried about what I'm worried about. And finally, I want to talk about shaping the future of work. And I really liked the remarks that Raphael and others made about the goal is not just to observe what's showing up, but to think about how we channel it. And I think that's incredibly important. So I'm going to end there. So let me start with the first point. Why are there still so many jobs? I'm going to give you a kind of a short answer, 2 points, and then I'm going to add to that. The first point is complementarity. I'll say what I mean by that. Many of you will know this example by now. This is a figure made by James Besson, who's an economic historian at Boston University. And it shows that in the kind of roughly 40 years after the introduction of the automated teller machine, those vending machines that dispense cash, the number of bank tellers employed in the United States roughly doubled between 1970 and 2010. So it raised the question, what are all those bank tellers doing, and why hasn't the ATM already made them irrelevant? Well, one thing that happened is just what you'd expect. When the ATM was introduced, the banks discovered they needed fewer people at the checkout desks, at the bank teller lines, and they reduced the number of tellers by about 1/3 at every branch. Simultaneously, they discovered that now that they could open a branch more cheaply and staff it with fewer workers, it made sense to have more branches. And so they expanded the number of branches, and those forces were roughly offsetting. But that's too simple. It's not just that the number of tellers was affected. The type of work they did also changed. They went from being primarily kind of checkout clerks for handling money to people who had to form relationships with customers and help them solve problems, introduce them to new products and services, or help them take loans. And so as the ATM took over more of these cash handling tasks, it put a premium on another set of skills that tellers use, which were their interpersonal, their interactive, and their problem-solving skills. And this example underscores a general point, which is that most work involves a range of tasks, not just a single repetitive activity. And those tasks, some of those tasks are rote and repetitive, and some are creative, and some require judgment. So you might say they're partly perspiration, partly inspiration, right? Partly mundane, partly sublime. But almost always all of those tasks need to be accomplished to get the work done. And so as we automate some subset of those tasks, it generally makes those that remain more valuable because they can be done more efficiently, and if they all need to be done, if you can do one set very quickly, the value of doing the other set well increases. That's what economists call complementarity. And now I'm going to give you a very extreme example of that. So many will know the US Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral on January 28, 1986. And within 90 seconds of takeoff, the booster rocket exploded, and the spaceship crashed to the ground, and 7 astronauts were killed. After a relatively short investigation, it was discovered that the cause of this crash was a single rubber O-ring on one of the booster rockets that had frozen on the launch pad the night before, and because of the freezing, it became brittle, and gas leaked, and the shuttle exploded. So this tragic example is actually made famous in economics by a paper called The O-Ring Theory of Development by Michael Kramer, who won the Nobel Prize just fittingly this fall. And he makes the following point. He says, well, the Space Shuttle Challenger example highlights something really critical, which is that in many things that we're doing, especially many sensitive processes, there's a series of interacting steps. And for you to complete that mission, in this case a successful launch and takeoff of a rocket, every one of those steps must be executed carefully. So you can think of these as, another way to think of them is like kind of links in a chain. And if you have a chain, and every link in the chain has to hold, and if one of those links should happen to break, the entire chain breaks and everything that's connected to it. So it's a very precarious situation. But it has a surprisingly positive implication, which is that let's say we start improving some of those links, right? We make them more robust, we make them stronger, make them more reliable. Well, as you do that, the value of improving all the other links rises, right? Because if one of them is going to break for sure, it doesn't matter if yours breaks or not. But in the limit, if we make each one of those links 100% reliable, the last task becomes all the more central, right? So if you are responsible for that last link, the value of your doing it right is massively magnified by improvements everywhere else along the chain. And so if you think about it in the case of the Space Shuttle Challenger, this was a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade effort to send people into space and back on a space plane. And in that multi-year effort, the only thing that went wrong was the rubber O-ring. And had it not, the mission probably would have succeeded. That's remarkable that it was so sensitive, but so much also that everything went well. But let me now tie this back to the bank tellers. The key point is that as we automate, we increase the value of the tasks that remain. We put a premium on our expertise, our judgment, and our creativity. And you don't have to be a bank teller or a rocket scientist for this to happen. If you're a teacher, if you're a doctor, if you are an architect, technology magnifies the scope of your decisions, makes them more important, and so gives additional leverage to ideas, to judgment, and to creativity. So that is, machines don't just replace us, they also complement us. Okay, so that's the first half of my answer, why are there so many jobs. Now you might say, okay, right, that sort of describes a type of work that people will do, right, work where judgment is important, but doesn't tell you how much work there will be to do. And it kind of seems self-evident that, if you get sufficiently productive at something, there'll just be less of it to do. So for example, in the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, so in 1899, 40% of all employment was in agriculture. At present, it's under 2%. And that purely reflects rising productivity. The US is not importing food from China, it's a major exporter. After a century of improvements in irrigation, in genetics, in mechanization, right, we have a setting where a couple million agricultural workers can feed a population of 320 million. That's remarkable progress. But look, there's only so many O-rings jobs left in farming, right? So there's no question that we have produced ourselves out of a job. However, what's true at the level of a single sector or a single activity has never been true at the level of the aggregate economy. Right? So many of the industries that people work in today, whether it be healthcare, financial services, or information technology, engineering, and devices, right, were tiny or barely, tiny or hadn't yet been invented 100 years ago. Many of the things that people spend money on, right, air conditioning, sport utility vehicles, mobile devices, were either inconceivably expensive or just didn't exist at the time this was going on. So it is almost always the case that as we raise productivity and displace one set of activities, the combination of rising income, greater technological potential, and a lot of human creativity creates additional demands, creates additional needs. Or I use the word needs in quotations. They're not necessarily needs, but they're things that people desire. And let me put a finer point on that. If you took let's say the average person in 2015 in the United States wanted to have the middle class income of someone from 1915, 100 years earlier. Well, they could do that by working about 18 weeks per year, and then they would be a middle class 1915 citizen. Most people don't choose to do that. Why? Presumably they think that the additional goods and services and experiences that are available by working hard, justify it, right? Even as incomes have risen and people's immediate needs and necessities have been met, they continue to work because there are many more experiences to have as technology improves our capabilities. Okay, so that's my two-part answer to the question of why are there so many jobs. One, automation doesn't just replace us, it also complements us. And two, in effect, we're insatiable. As we get wealthier, we find new things to consume, and that creates work. So now let me be a little more specific on this. Where does new work come from? And, excuse me. So I'm going to give you a four-part answer to that question rather than just asserting that there is new work. So I'm going to say there are four different places from which new work arises. So the first is what I'm going to call an Uber effect. You could also call it a bank teller effect. So if we look in Manhattan, in New York, in just the 3-year period between 2015 and 2018, the number of taxi trips, fell by about 40%. Sorry, the number is missing. But of course, why did that happen? Well, it's because the number of Uber and Lyft trips more than offset that, right? Roughly, in just those 3 years, the number of ride-hailing trips doubled. Why did that occur? Simply because the technology was cheaper, it was more convenient, and so when you make a product better, cheaper, faster, more enjoyable, you're going to get more demand, right? There are more people working in ride-hailing services than there were working in taxi driving 5 years earlier. Okay? And that's, you could say, what happened with the bank tellers to some extent. A second is what I'm going to call a Walmart effect in the US, or an income effect, which is that price declines free income and they spur consumption. So in the US, everyday low prices, this is drilled into your head as a child from Walmart's advertising. But what does that do? Well, here's data from the United States. For the course of a century, the share of household income spent on necessities. Necessities are food, clothing, and housing. So in 1901, the average household spent 80% of all of its income on just those 3 things, right? By 2000, that had fallen to about 60%, right? Even below that. Now, so that means that people had a lot more disposable income. Well, what did they do with that income? Well, they could have just saved it, but this is America. So that did not happen, right? People spent it. They spent it on other consumption goods, larger houses, better cars, going out to restaurants, more education, more health care, right? More entertainment. And so the net result was, as we met all our fundamental needs, we continued to perceive ourselves to have many other needs and opportunities, and that money gets spent. That tends to create work. Third, I'm going to do what I call network effects, or what economists would call sectoral linkages. So take the example of steel. So in just 40 years, the number of human labor hours to produce a ton of steel fell from 10 to 1.5. So that's an incredible productivity increase. Now you would think, correctly, that in the long run that would eliminate employment in steel. And that's true. However, in the United States at present, there are less than 400,000 people who work in the steel industry. Now, partly that's because we import a lot of steel, but even if it weren't importing steel, we would have fewer people working in steel. We'd be making more steel with more capital and fewer people. However, we also have more than 4 million jobs in other metal-using sectors, right? In metal manufacturing, in fabricated metal products, in machinery, motor vehicles, aerospace products. Why does that matter? Well, when productivity rises in steel, that is going to lower the price of steel. That's going to then lower the prices of all these other goods that depend on steel. And that's going to have, as their price falls, just like with Uber, people will buy larger cars, they will buy drones, they will buy all kinds of things. Many other things become feasible as technology improves one product. Notably also, as productivity increases in steel and output increases in steel, that actually creates more demand for ore and for power, right? So even though in one sector it is often the case that productivity growth will ultimately reduce employment in that activity, it will have both upstream and downstream linkages. By creating cheaper products, the things that use it will become cheaper and more abundant and therefore use more labor, and the inputs that it uses will also be more in demand, as is the case of power generation or ore inputs into making steel. So now let me turn to the fourth point, and this is, I think, the most fundamental and the most elusive. So if you think about those farmers in 1900, and you imagine yourself, go back in time 100 years and say, hey, guess what? I have some good news for you. You know how 40% of you are doing agriculture for a living? Well, 100 years from now, only 2% of you will be doing agriculture. So what do you think the other 95% of people will do? Well, some might have said, well, they'll just be unemployed. I don't know. Some might have said, I guess they'll do more of everything else. And so you would imagine that people would crowd into a narrower set of activities, that 100 years later, there'd be no one left in agriculture, so you have more people doing a finite number of tasks. But if you introspect for a minute, that's not true, right? The type of work that we do now has all kinds of variety that simply didn't exist 100 years ago. So to study that question, Anna Solomons and I, who's a professor at Utrecht University, have been trying to catalog the invention of new work over the course of a century. So to do this, we built on an idea by Jeffrey Lynn, who's an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And he made the observation that the US Census Bureau, right, it collects registers of the entire population every decade. And it asks everybody what they do for a living. And people just write that in textual form. Well, then the Census Bureau employs a group of people who read that text and try to classify people into occupations. And to do that, the Census Bureau creates a kind of a phone book of occupational titles, or an alphabetical listing. Maybe phone book is maybe some of you have never heard or seen a phone book. Okay, so it's an alphabetical listing, might be on paper. And in a typical decade, it'll have 20 or 30,000 detailed occupational titles. Now, when Census Bureau employees come across a title they haven't seen, and they come across it 10 or 50 or 100 times, they will bring this to the attention of their supervisor, and that will get added to the list. And so you can learn about the creation of new work by comparing successive versions of this list across decades. So inadvertently, the Census Bureau has created a census of types of work, and it's been doing it actually for 120 years. So in looking at this work in these lists, one thing Anna Solomons and I started off with, we sort of imagined that most of the new work would be kind of technology work, right? People who use the technology, who build the technology, who deploy the technology, what we call frontier work. And that's definitely a part of it. So here's a list of some of the frontier jobs added to the US Census in just 30 years. And of course, you all know George Jetson, symbol of the future in the past. In 1980, one of the frontier jobs was a supervisor of word processors. In 1990, it was a circuit layout designer. In 2000, artificial intelligence specialist. So I'm impressed that they captured that right in 2000. In 2000, also an echocardiographer, someone who works on heart echoes, a wind turbine technician, or a computer services director. So if you look through the list of new occupational titles, you will find roughly, loosely, a third, maybe 40% fall in this category. But there's another equally large category that does not fit that description at all. These are what we call, for short, wealth work. Jobs that do not have a technological component, but seem to rise because people's incomes rise and they demand new luxuries. So here are some examples. There's George. Does anyone know the name of George's robot friend? It's Rosie. Rosie the robot. Okay. So in 1980, gift wrappers were a new type of work in the United States. Fingernail formers in 1990. Horse exercisers in 2000, because you don't always have time to exercise your horse. The ever-popular oyster preparer. Sommelier. Now, so let me say, I notice I'm in a French-speaking part of the world, so let me say, the Census Bureau does not think sommeliers were invented in the year 2000. We understand they've been around for as long as the French Republic. But in the US, there were not enough of them to count. Okay, so this reflects the evolution, the refinement of US culture, if you can believe that. In 2016, just in time for the election, golf cart mechanic, right? So another important category of work is not just the technology using, but many of it is services to other people that become in demand as incomes rise. And I should say, not visible here, many of these would also be in health services, right, and would reflect both physical needs and also the aging of the population. There's a third category, and this is harder to see. These are jobs that are kind of fading out of existence. They're the last residual set of tasks in a job that is almost automated and will likely be gone in not so terribly long. We call these last mile jobs. So here are just some examples. So this is the robot winder, right? So this is a football playing robot, but it needs to be wound up. So you can see why that's sort of a last mile job, right? Eventually they'll figure out, they'll motorize that. Okay, so 1980, a tamale machine feeder, a vending machine attendant. Right? Actually, in Japan, right, most vending machine intensive country in the world, there are many people who work just refilling vending machines. A chat room host or monitor. right? That's a task that's begging to be automated, but it's been proved very hard to do so. An underground utility cable locator, or a teleprompter, right? A person who holds up signs for people to remember their cues. So what I want you to take away from that is that it's easy to see what is being automated, right? And because we know it's being automated. We see it even before it happens because we know what the machines are targeted to replace, right? It's not so hard to say there's complementarity, right? That the people who remain are more productive, their expertise becomes more valuable. What's harder still is to say where will new work emerge, what characteristics will it have, and what skills will it use? That's a really profoundly hard question. We're not good at forecasting that, but it's essential to this puzzle. And in some sense, the assertion that there will be new jobs is also an assertion that people will be creative and think of new things to do. And by and large, that seems to occur. So, to give you one concrete example, if you go back to the turn of the 20th century and look at the number of medical specialties in the census, there are only a few, right? You would have a general practitioner, you would have a gynecologist, you would have a surgeon. If you look at present, there are dozens and dozens of them. And that's not just because, people are trying to, look special, right? Medical knowledge is so much deeper than it was 100 years ago that it's impossible for any one person to be at the frontier of even a couple of fields, right? So you'll have podiatrists, and you'll have radiologists, and you'll have cardiologists, and so on. And so the deepening of expertise creates new work because it requires a deepening of human learning. Okay, so now let me ask the question, is there anything to worry about? So you might say, Autor has just come here from MIT, maybe he knows something, and he said, look, we're not running out of work. People are complemented, and moreover, we're insatiable, so there will always be jobs. So will this problem just take care of itself as a result? And so obviously, by the way I asked the question, I must think the answer is no. So what should we worry about? Well, first I should say, you could take it on other authority. The Economist says there is nothing to worry about. Across a rich world, an extraordinary job booms is underway. The zeitgeist has lost touch with the data. The strength of the labor market calls into question gloomy predictions about the future work. So The Economist has gone all in on the view that there actually is nothing to worry about. So representing the MIT Work of the Future Task Force, we say you should worry. First of all, public concern in our view is neither ill-informed nor misguided. There's no question that technological progress will deliver rising productivity, but it's an open question that the fruits of that rising productivity will reach the typical worker, that they will be shared and distributed in a way that is, that is constructive, that is viable, that creates a society that we all want to live in. So let me spell out some of these worries. One of them is what some economists call job polarization, reflecting the relative decline of many middle-skill jobs, office clerical, administrative support, production, and operative positions. These jobs, so those seem to be declining. What's coming up in their place? Well, on the right-hand side, you see a growth of professional and technical and managerial jobs. These are highly paid, highly skilled jobs. They're creative, they're secure, many things to like about them. Simultaneously, on the other side of the axis, you see a lot of growth of personal services, food service, cleaning, security, entertainment, recreation, home health care. And these jobs typically require fairly generic skill sets, meaning not high levels of education. And as a result, they are economically insecure. They don't tend to offer stability and rising wages over the life cycle. Now, it's not entirely mysterious why this is occurring. And I should say, at least the evidence, this is contentious, but according to some estimates, this is occurring throughout advanced economies. And it's pretty clear that automation has targeted specifically many of these, many of these middle skill activities. Why? Because they can be well described by rules. They follow procedures. And so it's easy, it has historically been easy, if we understand the procedure, to write a piece of software that executes it, whether it's adding a column of numbers, filing a piece of paper, or doing some repetitive assembly task on a production line. But of course, this creates a challenge, right? Because if this is correct, it has the effect of knocking out rungs in the economic ladder, right? Reducing the probability that people go from rags to riches and potentially, contributing to the erosion of the middle class. Not for sure, but possibly. A second concern, which you see more in some countries than others, is the remarkable growth of earnings inequality. And most of that growth of earnings inequality is not coming from the top 1%, in fact, but coming from staggering differences in earnings levels by education, more so than used to be the case. And this reflects the magnification of expertise, the value of expertise complemented by information technology. Simultaneously, for those who are not in that complementary category that's complemented, many of them are moving into these service positions I spoke about earlier that have relatively low productivity growth and relatively little opportunity for developing expertise that is well remunerated. A third source of concern, and this is something we see in the US more than many countries, is an incredible disconnect between aggregate productivity growth and the experience of the median worker. So if you look from the period from the end of the Second World War to the mid-1970s, productivity growth, which is the green line, and average worker compensation and the median worker compensation, so what the 50th percentile, moved in lockstep. After the mid-1970s, they completely decoupled, such that the average worker's wages have risen approximately equally with productivity growth, but for the median worker, that has not occurred at all, meaning that the average is highly skewed by top earnings. Okay, so there's a lot to be worried about. It's not lack of jobs. It's not lack of productivity. It's the distribution of jobs and the set of opportunities that are available for people at different levels of education. So when we think about this problem, I like to think about it as not just recognizing the problems, but shaping the future of work. So specifically, one is raising skills. So I mentioned that agricultural employment fell from 40% to 2%. And in fact, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, agricultural employment in the United States was falling at the rate of 0.5 percentage point per year as a share of all workers. People in farm states noticed this, and they were concerned that their children would no longer be needed on the farm and yet would not be qualified for industry. And so they took a very radical step, which is they passed laws requiring that their children stay in school until age 16, right? I wish I could pass laws for my kids, actually. So there's something to that. But this was a big, risky idea, right? It was expensive because you had to build buildings, you had to hire teachers, you had to buy books, but even more so, it meant that those kids who normally would be working on the farm from age 9 forward, if not earlier, were not able to do so because they were in school. Many people thought that this was a frivolous idea. Why does everyone need to both be literate and numerate? And is it really the case that most people are even capable of that level of expertise? Arguably, it was the best public investment the US made in the 20th century. It gave the US the most flexible, the most productive, and the most formally skilled labor force in the world and it facilitated US economic growth in that time. In many countries, that process slowed down after the 1970s. The rate of attainment of years of schooling was growing at about 0.7 like 3/4 of a year per decade in the first part of the century, and then fell to about 1/3 of that afterwards. That's part of the reason we've seen so much growth in inequality. It's actually that the supply of highly educated workers is not moving out as rapidly as the demand, and it was doing that decades earlier. So one thing, clearly and not controversially, is we need to keep raising skills at the pace of technological advancement. And just to make it very concretely clear, why is that so important? If you imagine taking the workforce of 1899 and plopping them in contemporary Zurich, right? Many of them would be of sound mind and good character, but they would be completely unqualified for most of the work that's being done. Only 1/3 of them would be illiterate, and 2/3 of them would be enumerate. They would not have the skills to do the work that's required. So as we change the nature of work, we need to change the nature of our skills to continue to be complemented by them. And that's a public project. That's not just an individual project. A second is aligning incentives to invest in physical capital and in human capital. So this figure shows you that in many advanced economies, labor's share of national income has fallen over the last decade. What I mean is, of all the value added created, some of it is distributed to labor and the rest is distributed to capital. That share had been steady through most of the 20th century. It's now fallen by about 5 percentage points in many countries. Why is that a problem? Well, look, the income still goes to people. Ultimately, it's not paid to the machines, it's paid to the owners of the machines. However, ownership of things is distributed far more unequally than ownership of labor. Most people own some labor, presumably their own. And so we should be worried about this a bit. And I would argue that, and I'm not the only one making this argument, that we provide excessive incentives for firms to buy machines rather than invest in workers. And in a world where the tax code treated these things more commensurately, there would actually be less automation, not because automation is problematic, but because the government is actually paying you to substitute workers with machines, right? So that is something that we can adjust. That's within the scope of policy. A third is steering innovation towards raising productivity. So one of the very uncomfortable secrets of the last 15 years is that the rate of productivity growth in most of the rich world has been slower in the last 15 years than in the 15 years preceding it, including Switzerland. I put it up there. This just shows you the fraction of households that are plugged in with broadband. This shows you the change in the rate of productivity growth, and almost all of it is negative. You could say, well, why is that happening? Well, no one knows for sure. But one thing is, a lot of the technologies that we are developing are amazing, they're cool, but they may not be addressing the most fundamental problems, right? So if you think about the technologies that, that have been introduced in the 20th century, electrification, right, indoor plumbing, the internal combustion engine or the motor car, the airplane, air conditioning, these fundamentally change the texture of human life. Many of the technologies that we are amazed by in the last 20 years are about convenience. They basically, many of them replicate things that we already had other ways of doing, but do it cheaper or faster or in a flashier way. That is fine, that's fun, but that won't fundamentally raise productivity. And I mention this not because I want to disparage the amazing work that people do, but because technology doesn't happen on its own. It's directed by what people think are important problems to focus on, what are the incentives for R&D, which government often has a very large role in, and where are profits to be made. And so invention is not an exogenous independent activity. It is shaped by incentives. And so we have scope to change those incentives in a way that gets us what we want. Okay. Finally, and this is an important point that many people are not aware of, when many people are worried about the end of work, I'm much more worried about the falling supply of new workers. So in every advanced economy, the age dependency ratio, meaning the fraction of the ratio of people age 65 plus to people of age 16 to 64 is rising steeply. So for example, in Switzerland, that's projected to rise from about 27% to 45% by 2050. In Italy, that'll be 65%. That creates a real challenge. Right? It creates it on multiple levels. One, of course, people who are retired will have care needs. Two, we will have, because of low fertility, in many cases countries are below replacement fertility, we'll have smaller sets of young people entering the labor market to do that care work and do much of the physically demanding work that will need to occur. In addition, people are becoming more educated, which is a good thing, but it makes them even more reluctant to do that manual work. And then, of course, many countries, the US among them, are increasingly restricting immigration. That would be another source of supply. So in 4 different ways, we are going to face a demographic crunch that will create ongoing labor scarcity for decades to come. And so that creates both a challenge and an opportunity. It means that we need to be able to raise productivity in many activities that we've not historically been good at raising productivity in. Raising productivity in care work, raising productivity in food service, in transportation, in security. Many of those, and especially in education, by the way. Education uses a lot of expensive people. So this is, and if you want to see this live today, spend a week in Tokyo, right? And you will see the challenge that is created by a rapidly aging population. Not by accident, Japan leads the world in robotics, one of the leaders in robotics. Also, by the way, leads the world in innovating in drugs that treat diseases of the elderly. Right? all of which points out that the innovation that occurs depends on what are the incentives and what are the problems people see in front of them. It doesn't happen on its own. Okay, so let me sum up, and then I welcome your questions. So first of all, the challenge ahead is not scarcity of work. There will be plenty of work to do. But job quantity does not guarantee job quality. And in many countries, Switzerland less than many others, by the way, there's a job quality problem, that jobs are quite bifurcated, that there have never been more great jobs for people with high levels of education, but for those without, there are plenty of jobs, but fewer good careers, careers that have economic security, rising skills and expertise over the life cycle. Much more work is of the generic form. That's a problem. And new technologies, they will raise productivity, I have no doubt of that, but they do not guarantee shared prosperity, right? And that's not a function of the technologies themselves. That's a function of the institutions that shape, that translate from inputs to outcomes. And those are very much in the control of all of us. So, final points. We overestimate our machines. We overestimate their capabilities all the time. And we also think of them as controlling our fates, that whatever machine appears, we must respond to that, as opposed to thinking about what machine we want to appear. Similarly, we underestimate ourselves. We fail to appreciate both what our capabilities are and also the agency that we have over the way society is organized and the technologies we adopt and the distribution of outcomes that follows from that. And so both of those errors lead to complacency, lead people to think that whatever is happening is going to happen and our job is just to hold on tight and hope it works out well. And that's not correct. And the important lesson of history is that at crucial times in our history, when we have introduced new technologies that have shaped the future of work, we've invested in ourselves in a way that has made us complementary, by raising our educations, by changing our institutions, to share the prosperity that follows. And so we have lots of good things can happen, but the future will not take care of itself. That's your job. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, David. When we were discussing amongst ourselves, the decision that was taken as late as last afternoon was that I would moderate the questions and answers. So my wife works for a technology company, Oracle, and this is absolutely apocryphal. Apparently, Larry Ellison once said, "Tell me what it is that you do very slowly, and by the time you finish your sentence, I will automate you," right? So I have been automated by Slido, so I will no longer be moderating, right? So there is technology, so www.slido.com or just sli.do. And the tag for this meeting is E4S, it has to be. So if you do capital E4S, then you can type in your questions. So I still have the last mile job of checking which questions will be asked.
Great.
All right, so that will be presented on your iPad.
Great, okay, so I have three to begin with. Yeah. So let me read the first one out loud. So if I have a 4-year-old boy, what education should I encourage him to go for to fit the work environment in 20 years? So, and I will mention I also have children, and I ask myself this question, and I can't pass laws for them. I wish I could. So I would say the comparative advantage of human beings in all times and places is our flexibility. It's our ability to adapt to uncertain environments and use judgment and creativity to solve problems that are ill-posed and often unrecognized. Right? So people often talk about, isn't it amazing that machines learn from big data? And the answer is yes, that's amazing. What's even more amazing is that people learn from small data. Right? You can show a picture of a bicycle to your 4-year-old, and after 1 or 2 pictures, that child will be able to recognize not just a bicycle, but a tricycle, a motorcycle, a bicycle wrapped around a tree, a unicycle. Right? We have an incredibly adaptive and complex capacity for dealing with unfamiliar situations. So that flexibility is incredibly important, it's invaluable, but it needs to be cultivated, right? So what education, in the best case, allows us to do is be analytic, be communicative, right? And to be scientific in the way that we approach the world. So fundamental skills for anyone at this point are, of course, reading and writing and arithmetic, but also how to how to weigh information analytically, right? How to reach well-reasoned conclusions, how to write that down, right? I teach at MIT. I can tell you, good writing is, scarcer than it ever has been, and how to communicate that to others and how to lead. And that can occur in many settings. The fastest growing jobs in many countries are not actually the pure technology jobs. They're jobs that often involve translation between technology and other people. That could be in medicine, that could be in management, that could be in education. And so it is not the case that everybody needs to be, a botnet herder or, an artificial intelligence, guru to make a living. That's certainly not true. The future will continue to reward expertise. It'll continue to reward judgment. It'll continue to reward communication, and it'll continue to reward creativity. So I think, for your 4-year-old, I don't think there's a simple answer, but it's some combination of developing broad skills and doing things that you find rewarding. Obviously, none of it's going to work out or it'd be harder for it to work out in that case. Okay, let's see. If consumerism largely drives productivity, which needs more and more natural resources, how can we handle the dilemma, i.e. the need to invent new jobs? So first of all, let me remark, consumerism doesn't drive productivity, but it does drive a lot of demand, right? So I would put it in this way, productivity raises incomes, incomes feed consumerism, consumerism leads to lots of labor demand. But it is absolutely the case that natural resources are an enormous challenge. In many ways, I would say that the problems that we face with natural resources are not fundamentally scarcity of resources. They are misallocation coming from bad incentives, right? Global warming is a solvable problem. The solution to that problem, though, is not exclusively technological. It's incentives, right? The reason there's so much carbon pollution is because the incentives are wrong, right? We don't pay for the carbon pollution that we create, and therefore we create a lot of it. That is a governance problem. Unfortunately, governance problems are harder than technological problems. So it's easy for me to say this is an economic problem, but then actually solving it is challenging. So, but I will say that fundamentally, I think that the problem is not that we can't accommodate. Remember that world population is actually plateauing, right? Fertility falls dramatically as countries get wealthier, and people's propensity to pollute, right? Their demand for a clean environment rises. Global warming is a harder problem because it's a global one. It's not just how much pollution do you create in your country. Okay. What would be so I hope that was at least something of an answer, if not an adequate one. What would be the role of governments in protecting the laws, protecting labor, if any? That's a really, I think, a very important point, one I didn't touch on in my talk. In many countries, the US being the most extreme example, the notion of the appropriate role of labor in deciding outcomes has changed a lot. So in the 1950s, Milton Friedman, Nobel-winning Chicago economist, put forward the idea that the only job of corporations is to make profits, and anything else, looking at any other stakeholder, whether it's labor, whether it's communities, whether it's charity, is a distortion that ought to be eliminated. That idea was radical in 1950. By 1980 in the United States, it was beginning to be accepted. By 2000, it was widely accepted. The US has a pure shareholder-stakeholder model where labor is not considered a stakeholder in the decisions of corporations. I feel that this has cost the US a lot, caused a misalignment between productivity growth and the distribution of earnings, and causes us not only to be highly unequal, but also to underinvest, to treat workers as disposable. So I do not think that, many people would say with automation and so on, there's no room anymore for bargaining, it's all the market. I don't think that's true at all. The countries that are best prepared to manage the challenge, the transitions that will inevitably occur as new jobs are created and some jobs are eliminated, are the ones that have a social partnership between industry, between labor and government, because that leads to, one, a lot of the right targeted training, and two, a lot of the internalization of the costs that would otherwise be borne by labor. So I very much hope the US will be moving towards Western Europe in modernizing its labor institutions, but also revitalizing them. So I think there's enormous scope for improvement there, and I think Switzerland is well above the median in how successfully it does this, especially vocational education. Okay, so globalization has resulted in the outsourcing of jobs in the OECD to developing countries. Isn't this an important externality of future work in the US and workforce? So there's no question that globalization has reshaped labor markets and done so dramatically. The US would be the country that probably felt most strongly the brunt of China's rise. When China opened to the World Trading Organization, the US merchandise trade deficit with China rose to about 3% of GDP. A couple of million US manufacturing workers were essentially displaced from manufacturing and had to seek work outside of it because we substituted so many imported goods for things that we used to produce. So absolutely, globalization creates challenges. It also creates opportunities. I want to say, trade between consenting nations will raise GDP in all of them. However, and this is the principle of comparative advantage, it's been known since David Ricardo, and there's a lot of strong evidence that as countries open to world trade, they tend to grow faster. Productivity rises, incomes rise. But that creates distributional challenges. The challenge of globalization is not that there's a finite amount of work to do, so if it's not done here, if it's done there, it's not done here. That I don't think is the problem. The problem is that it does rapidly change the values of certain skills. Right, so in the US, the very rapid decline of manufacturing, which fell by a third between 1999 and 2011, meant a set of people who were in stable blue-collar jobs suddenly had to look for new work, and that new work wasn't nearly as appealing and didn't make as good use of their skill sets. In the long run, that's a problem we can manage, but the rate of transition matters a lot. Right? So we can all stipulate, 30 years from now, vehicles will drive themselves. We won't need professional drivers. In the US, that would mean the elimination of 4 million approximately transportation jobs. So if we say that'll happen by 2050, that's a completely manageable problem, right? Because people retire from work. People don't enter contracting fields. If we say that that's going to happen, by May of 2020, that's a very big problem. Right? That's an enormous amount of disruption that we're not well equipped to manage. So I think the challenge of globalization is not finiteness of jobs. It's not that there isn't a potential for it to create aggregate benefits, but often it creates rapid change, often more rapid than technological change, in fact, because it rapidly changes prices, it puts certain sectors out of business, and that is always painful and disruptive. And countries need to be, if they want to reap the benefits of globalization, need to be prepared to provide the social insurance that makes that acceptable. In other words, retraining people or managing the rate of change. The US, again, provides a great example of how not to do this because we did it super fast and we didn't have any insurance policies in place, social insurance policies, and you got a lot of angry people, some of them who voted in an unexpected way in 2016. So I think it's a very important problem and we can do better on it. How do you see the work of the future for women? Okay, well, so I see that as especially bright. So in the U.S., first of all, there now more than 50% of all people in the U.S. labor force are women, and this has happened briefly at other times, but now it looks likely to be the norm for a number of reasons. One, women are now more educated than men in almost every advanced country, and why did that happen? Well, a better way to ask the question is, why didn't it happen sooner? Because it's almost always the case that women do better in primary and secondary school, measured by grade point averages and achievement, than do boys. But historically, women were restricted from going forward, and boys were not. So women have, now as those social mores have slowly been eroded, women have surpassed men in higher education, and many of the work of the future will use those highly educated skills and will put a premium on communication, on interpersonal skills, and women, at least by, need to have some comparative advantage in that. What has been equally hard is the elimination of many physically intensive blue-collar work, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's mining, and so on, for reasons that could have to do with societal norms, could have to do with intrinsic preferences. Men have historically done a lot of those. And so the elimination of that work has been difficult more difficult for men than for women. So here's an interesting example. We talk a lot about the China shock and how it eliminated a lot of manufacturing work. Nobody talks about the word processor shock and the effect it had on clerical employment. But it is the case that clerical employment is much smaller now than it was before the era of office automation as a share of employment. Why didn't we talk about that shock? Well, one reason is that women so successfully adapted, right? As those middle skill jobs declined, women moved up the educational distribution and into professional and technical and managerial work. So I worry more about the adjustment, the shifting of roles, and how how the sexes will adapt to that more than the opportunities for women per se, which I think look even more positive over time. Oh, sorry, I keep waiting for hands. What are the drivers for productivity in low productivity and aging societies, Italy and Japan? Yeah, so this is actually an interesting fact. It's not the case that aging societies are less productive. Japan is actually a highly productive country. Italy is not highly productive, but that was true before it was aging. It's not obvious that this has been as great a break on growth as people thought it would be. So one reason that's the case, by the way, is that the cohorts that are in late career now are the most educated people who are 55 to 65 that the world has ever seen, right? Because they benefited from this enormous boost. So more educated people have longer working spans because the work they do is less physically demanding. Their bodies don't wear out. It's more intellectually engaging, so they want to do it. So in the US, in fact, we have a setting where retirement rates are falling very rapidly, and it's actually slowing entry of young adults into the labor force. So it actually turns out there's a little bit of a musical chairs phenomenon. This is easy to understand if you're an academic, right? So if you want to open a new tenure position, one of your faculty members has to pass away. So I don't think aging per se is the challenge. It does create a challenge, not a productivity challenge, which is the care need challenge. That's very substantial. So it's not about productivity, but it does require an enormous redistribution of resources. I think that is a challenge. How do we raise productivity? This is really tough. If we look across countries, many of the countries to which we compare ourselves, they have access to similar technology, right? They're all globalized in some important sense. They're all democracies to some extent. And they all have modern educational systems. But the level of productivity they achieve is quite different. And I think much of that has to do with societal organization. How well targeted are the education training systems? How much is corruption or good governance boosting productivity? And do people face the right incentives, right? Do they face the incentive to produce new products and services that people value, or they face incentives to sort of game the system and extract what we call rents without actually producing a lot? And this varies across sectors, varies across countries. So I think the challenges are institutional rather than technological. Okay, let's see. Greta Thunberg, arguments point to lower consumption. Do you worry about this? Yes, I think it's a really important, it's a hugely important problem, and but I think of it as a collective action problem. I do not think this is a problem that people will solve with good intentions. They need to face incentives, and that's the economic problem, right? I drive a car that consumes too much gas. I feel badly about that. And my wife says, well, why don't you get rid of it and get an electric car? I say, well, I'll do that when we pass a law that makes my car illegal, which I'm in favor of passing that law. I will vote for that law. But I won't do it on my own because it doesn't matter. If I make that choice individually, it has no effect on collective outcomes, right? And someone would just buy my car from me anyway and use it. So I do think we need to consume less or consume differently, but I think that will not come about to an important extent through individual choice. It will come about through collective action. And that's why it's ironically both technologically a simple problem and politically such a hard one. Okay, let's see. I'm 65. I'm 65 years old, full of life and capable. That's great. I still work and would continue to work. What are the new skills I should learn? So just the statement that you feel that someone is physically and mentally healthy at 65 and wants to work is itself an incredibly positive sign, right? And there's much evidence that work is good for people. and that continuing to stay engaged maintains mental flexibility, it creates social benefits, I think is something that economists forget to mention way too frequently, which is that work is not just about income generation. Work is about identity. People's jobs are not just what they do so they can go home and consume stuff. Work provides purpose, it provides intellectual challenges, it provides a social environment, a set of friends, and a place, and even esteem. So I think there are many reasons to venerate work and many reasons to encourage ongoing work as long as people feel comfortable doing it. So in terms of what skills you should learn, that's a very broad question. It depends enormously where you are now, what skills you have, and what you want to do with them. I will say that there's never been a better time for accessing new skills, right? For accessing learning, in that it's available and it's free. It doesn't make it easy. Online education, for example, has primarily benefited people who are already good at learning. But if you're 65 and you feel full of life and capable, I suspect you also are good at this. So I think that the challenge is only to choose what you want to invest in, and maybe by targeting where you want to go next. Okay, how do I see the evolution of home office? Yeah, this is I think, a very hard question, in the sense that a lot of the design of jobs reflects the idea that you had to be in a place to do the work. Right? You just couldn't, you couldn't bring your manufacturing work home with you, you couldn't bring the factory home with you, except in the earlier artisanal period. Many white-collar jobs required access to information and tools that were in the physical office. Even the way higher education is designed, right? It's designed around the idea that you need to all be in a place where all the books were stored, right? Even the phone books, and where all the professors, and everyone had to be physically together. And none of that is really true anymore. And we see that. We see that shaping not only, first of all, almost everybody brings their work home with them or in their pocket everywhere they go. Secondly, many types of work are being disintermediated from, meaning cut off from traditional forms of employment. So that would be driving work, it would be food delivery work, it might be cleaning work, dog walking services. All kinds of things are being turned into app-based jobs. And without rendering a judgment on whether that's good or bad in the long run, our institutions are not set up for it. Right? Our institutions are predicated on the idea that people have a full-time job, and through that job, they get certain benefits, and then the social safety net fills in around that. And if that structure changes rapidly, then we're going to have to change the way we support that structure. I think that's feasible, but it will be a big change. We don't know how fast it'll go. So I do think this type of phenomenon will prove really important, and the relationships we take for employment as a given should not be assumed to be that stable. I'll just give you a funny example. So in the United States, if Uber and Lyft, which are major providers of transportation services, their workers, the people who drive vehicles for them are not considered employees or even contractors. They are under US law, they're like dating apps, right? It's like, you want to ride, you want to drive, go on a date. And it's an amazing distortion of the, even the small amount of labor protection that US labor law would provide, not happening in that mechanism. So it suggests that a lot of rethinking needs to occur as the arrangements change. Okay, the shift in types of jobs takes time. What is your opinion on universal minimum wage to protect the workforce going redundant? Okay, so that's interesting. So you said, someone out there said universal minimum wage as opposed to universal basic income. So those are two different things in the way I think about it. Universal basic income is unconditional cash transfer. Universal minimum wage is a minimum amount you earn if you are working. And I think those have very different properties. I favor the notion of something like a universal minimum wage. I think that if people work, we want work to provide a sufficient standard of living. And that means certain types of labor protections. It means certain types of expectations of earnings, and productivity has to rise along with it, right? You can't just mandate high wages. You can't just say, hey, everyone's middle class, right? That's not going to work. But it is the case that the institutions actually push productivity, right? So if workers are more expensive, firms have an incentive to make them more productive to justify that, right? I'll give you another example related to this, not exactly the same. I was speaking with the head of a major German manufacturing company about his firm's use of robotics, and and I said, well, do you have a lot of robots that are just coming in, you're substituting for people at their jobs? And he said, well, that's not really an option for me because we have these labor protections. I can't just make 1,000 or 10,000 workers redundant, right? I'm just going to have to deploy them to something else. I'm going to have to retrain them, or I'm going to have to pay them whether they can work for me or not. So I'm not especially interested in the technologies that simply substitute workers. I want robots that make people more productive because I have these people, I've invested in those people, I'm going to be working with those people. And so the incentives around the design, the institutions of work change the way people are used. I assure you that minimum wage workers are less productive in the United States because they're paid less, and therefore employers will use them differently given that low rate of pay. So I think there's a lot, you have to calibrate this, but there are many reasons to improve the quality of, and even subsidize work. I'm much less excited about a universal basic income. As I've already asserted, you may not believe me, I don't think we're running out of work, and so I don't think there's a reason to subsidize leisure. I think there's a reason to make work well for people, both because it needs to be done and because, at least in my opinion, it has many benefits for the people who do it. Okay, let's see. In the future, will AI invent work for us humans? I don't think so. I think we'll continue to invent work for ourselves, but it is an important and open question about what AI will do. And let me say, I think this is one of the areas of great uncertainty, and anyone who's confidently forecasts exactly what will happen over the next 10 or 20 years is someone you should not pay attention to, right? Because there's just no way to know. But I will say there is something fundamentally different about AI from prior generations of technology that's at least worth paying attention to. So first of all, technology is not a generic thing, right? What the tractor did is different from what the factory did, is different from what the personal computer did, right? So all these technologies have different characteristics. They complement and substitute for a different set of human tasks and capabilities. What artificial intelligence does, and many of you probably know this better than I, is historically when we wanted to automate something using information technology, we would write down all the steps, and then we would codify them in software, and then the machine would execute them. And that would be true if we were playing chess, if we were doing bookkeeping, if we were calculating the trajectory of a rocket, right? Those are all closed problems that are formally understood, and therefore were subject to procedural programming. And that need for procedures was always a constraint on how fast things could move, right? Because we couldn't program something until we fully understood it. And there are many, many things that we do not understand how we do them. Right? There's an observation of the philosopher Michael Polanyi who said, we know more than we can tell. We know how to use language, but we do not know the procedure for formally what grammar does, or how you communicate meanings. We know how to ride a bicycle, but I couldn't explain it to you how I do it, right? We know how to recognize a face after we haven't seen someone for 3 decades, but we don't really know the formal procedure for doing that. So that was always a constraint on what could be automated using traditional procedural programming. As you all understand, artificial intelligence makes a kind of end run around that because we don't have to fully understand it. Where you can say, look, here's the problem, here's some examples, you look at them, and come up with some, make some inferences statistically about how to do it, and then maybe the machine can do it. Now, we all understand that at present that has grave limitations, right? Machines do not have good judgment. They make bad calls in many settings. But so do people, right? So it is the case that many jobs that we do involve kind of a mixture of following a set of rules and procedures to get information, to make some calculations, to gather data, and then we kind of make a seat of the pants judgment. It's not clear that we're so good at that either. And so it's possible that many of the kind of middle-level judgmental decision-making jobs will be increasingly automatable. And we don't know to what degree that will substitute for people and to what degree it will complement them and make new opportunities. So, just one concrete example, in its early days, Amazon had people who decided how much to order of each product. Right? Now it has millions and millions of SKUs of individual products, and there's no person who does that job. Right? That's fully a mixture of kind of conventional programming and artificial intelligence that makes judgments about how much of what they should keep where in their warehouses. That would have been a job that wasn't really automatable even 15 years ago, unless the goal was just to keep the shelves stocked with the same stuff. So it is changing, and I think the scope for where that goes is unknown. Do you see more free time in the future of work? I wish. Yeah, so absolutely, no, absolutely the answer is yes, right? So people, we perceive ourselves as working very hard, and I'm sure we all do, but people enter the working world much later in life. They retire when they have a large number of healthy years remaining. They have nights and weekends. The average hours worked, has fallen in most rich countries from something like 4,000 per year to something like 2,000 per year or below over the course of the 20th century. So people work long days, but they have much more leisure over the course of a lifetime and much longer periods of better health in which to enjoy that leisure. So I do think we will continue on that trend. Okay, well, thank you so much for all your questions. Thanks for listening. And congratulations on this, the formation of this valuable institution. I'll look forward to seeing where it goes.
Well,
thank you.
It's for us to thank you. You can stay here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, David, for this insightful, unexpected, and really entertaining discussion on a very profound topic. And I myself, I'd like to thank the public. I think the questions you asked are really wonderful, and I think they touch upon the subject. Also involved in this was Anand and IMD here. I'd like to thank them, and especially Igor, who organized all of this, and David from EPFL. They were all involved in this. So a big round of applause for those people who organized.
At IMD, our goal is to spark great conversations. So again, although mediated by technology, we had a wonderful conversation, and with this question about the end of work, it's the end of your work this evening. We have some drinks, to spark further conversations. So we'll see you outside. Thank you very much for coming this evening.